HTTP versus HTTPS is very common topic yet loosely understood. So in this video, I'm trying to break it down for you, simplify it so that understanding it becomes easier. So in this video, we are going to understand about TLS and SSL, symmetric key, asymmetric key, public key, private key, and where do the certificates come into the play. So let's understand a very basic difference between HTTP and HTTPS, which is this addition of this S, and this S means secure. So what does that mean? So in case of HTTP here, whatever data is exchanged, it is exchanged in form of plain text, which means anyone sitting in between will be able to read whatever is being exchanged between client and the server. In case of HTTPS, all the data that is exchanged between client and the server are encrypted, and it won't be easy for anyone sitting in the between to read them. So let us also understand this from the OSI layer's perspective. So in the OSI layer, we are mostly concerned about the application and the transport layer. So transport layer is where the TCP protocol operates. Now let's say that we have a client and we have a server, and client wants to send a GET request, which is HTTP GET request that operates on this layer 7 application layer. So in case of HTTP, we are trying to send a GET request. So before client's GET request is sent, in the step 1, there is a TCP handshake. So TCP handshake happens at layer 4 before client's actual GET request is sent. But once the TCP handshake is successful, then a step 2 happens, and in the step 2, client can send the GET request. Let's see what happens in case of HTTPS. If a client wants to send a GET request to the server, then what happens? So in the first step, it's the same in case of both HTTP and HTTPS, which is the TCP handshake. In the second step, in case of HTTP, we sent the GET request, the HTTP GET request. However, in case of HTTPS, we are not going to send GET request, or GET request is not sent. Rather, there is a step 2, which is an additional step involved, which is also called as TLS handshake. We haven't talked about TLS much yet. We are going to talk about it. Just bear with me for this example. And then in the third step, this is the step where the actual HTTP GET request is sent. What essentially separates the HTTPS from HTTP is the presence of SSL or TLS protocols. So these protocols operate somewhere in between layer 7 and layer 4. So what you can assume is that any data, application data that has to be sent, it will be sent to the SSL and TLS protocols for encryption, and then it will be forwarded for layer to layer 4 for transportation. So you will find that at some places it's mentioned that SSL and TLS operate on layer 7. Some places would say that it operates at layer 6.5, which isn't it's not a valid OSI layer, but just to indicate that it operates somewhere in between 7 and 4. So it is safe to assume that it may operate at layer 7, or somewhere in between layer 7 and layer 4. So now let us see what are SSL and TLS protocols. So SSL is Secure Socket Layer, and TLS stands for Transport Layer Security. They both are security protocols. They help in encryption and decryption of the data so that data can be transmitted securely over the network. And one thing to note here is that SSL is the precursor or predecessor of the TLS protocol. So TLS protocol is the newer protocol, and this is what is being used across the internet. So if you see any website using HTTPS, so it's mostly is implementing a TLS rather than SSL. So TLS is basically a significant improvement over SSL in terms of performance and in terms of security. So I think there were a couple of versions of TLS as well. So it was 1.1, 1.2, 1.3. And I guess 1.3 is the latest one, if I'm not wrong. But yeah, that's the entire essence and the idea behind SSL and TLS protocol. They are not present in case of HTTP without S. But in case of HTTPS, TLS is what is mostly being used today. Now we are going to understand how encryption and decryption will happen when a client and server try to communicate. So here is a client and here is a server who want to communicate over this HTTP channel, but here is a hacker. So we want to protect our data from the hacker, right? So for that, what we are going to do is that we are going to encrypt our data and send it, and server is going to decrypt our data and use it. So if the data is encrypted, then hacker would not be able to understand what's there, right? So that's what we want to achieve. But encryption and decryption is going to happen using a key. So there is a key that's used for encrypting and decrypting data, and this is also called as symmetric key. Why symmetric? Because the same key has to be made available to the server as well. Same key. So what will happen? The same key is used to encrypt the data, and same key will be used by server to decrypt. Now what the problem is right now? How this key should be exchanged so that both client and server should have it. If this key is compromised and hacker is able to get the hold of that symmetric key, then hacker will also be able to decrypt our data. But which means the problem that we want to solve is how to exchange the symmetric key. That's the question. Another important point to note here is that this particular symmetric key is also called as session key sometimes, which means this particular symmetric key will be valid only for that session. And once that session is over, this symmetric key will be of no use. Secondly, this symmetric key is created by client, which means client is going to create this symmetric key, and client needs to send this symmetric key to the server safely so that no one in between should be able to see that symmetric key. That symmetric key should be exchanged or sent to the server safely, and that's the problem that we want to solve here. How to exchange this symmetric key so that both client and server should have it without the key being compromised. And this is the point, ladies and gentlemen, where we are ready to learn about asymmetric keys. So asymmetric keys basically comprise of a public key and a private key. So what essentially is a public and a private key? So just to understand that, let's consider there is a host. This host can be anyone. It can be a client, it can be a server, or just any host who has its own public key, and the host also has its own private key. A public key is also called as a public key because this particular key can be shared across other hosts on the internet. It can be shared across the network. This public key. The private key here, this particular private key should remain with the host. It should be with the host. It should never be shared with anyone. Now, any of these hosts who want to send data securely to this particular host, like our host, which we just saw here, if any one of these hosts want to send data securely to this host and they have the public key of our host, what they can do is they can simply encrypt data using host's public key and send it. Now, no one in the world except this host can decrypt that data. Reason is that data can only be decrypted using the host's private key. So what do we understand by this? Any data, and like if we have a public and a private key, so any data encrypted using public key will only be decrypted using the private key, corresponding private key. So in this case, these clients or these hosts can send the data by encrypting it using the host's public key that was shared to them previously, and that data can be decrypted. Once encrypted, it can only be decrypted by this host. right here, because this is the only host that has the private key, access to the private key. So using this concept of asymmetric key or the public and the private key, we are going to transfer the symmetric key that we have seen here. This particular symmetric key will be transmitted with the help of the asymmetric key. How? If that's confusing, don't worry at all. You are going to understand it. It's very simple. So we are going to transmit this symmetric key or the session key using the public key and the private key. Now, where is the public key? So the public key and the private key is going to be with the server. Server will have its own public key. So let me draw the private key with some other color. So green, this is the private key. So this in red is the public key. So what happens essentially? So client is going to say, client is going to tell server that I want to connect with you over HTTPS. And then server is going to respond to the client and send its public key. So this is where the server is going to respond to the client and send its public key. Now client will have the server's public key here. Now what client is going to do? Client, using this public key, client is going to encrypt the symmetric key here. So this particular symmetric key, so let me draw it like this. This is the symmetric key, and that will be encrypted using the public key of the server. So inside is the symmetric key, and outside, which means this is encrypted using the public key of the server. Now this particular thing will be sent to the server. Now what server can do is that server can decrypt. Server is going to receive that box, the symmetric key, which is encrypted using server's public key. Now because server has its own private key, so using this private key, server is going to decrypt the symmetric key that was sent by the client, and then server can take that out. Server is going to take out that symmetric key, and hence server will have the symmetric key, right? So that's how, using asymmetric key, we are securely exchanging the symmetric key. Now client and server both have the symmetric key. Now once they have the symmetric key, access to the symmetric key, server here is having the symmetric key, client here is having the symmetric key. Now they can securely exchange the data, right? But there is a problem. We wanted to securely send this particular symmetric key to the server, and we are doing it by encrypting it using the server's public key, and the corresponding private key is secure with the server, and server is the only one who can decrypt and extract the symmetric key out of it. Then where is the problem? This is where we are sending it, right? So what is the problem with this? Problem is not by how we are sending it back, but the problem is where server was sending its public key. When client said that I want to connect with you, server responded by its public key. Now what if the hacker sitting here has its own public and the private key, and that hacker replaces the server's public key with its own public key, right? So let me just draw that. So let's assume this hacker has its own private key and has its own public key, maybe in the blue color. So what if this hacker took out the server's public key and replaced it with its own public key? Now client is going to have the hacker's public key, but client wouldn't be aware about that. Now client is going to, in response, client will encrypt the symmetric key inside the hacker's public key, right? And once this is sent, the hacker is going to decrypt using its own private key. So hacker is going to have the symmetric key eventually, and entire communication can be hacked. And that is where certificates come into the play. So just to understand certificates, let me clear up some space here. As we know that server is going to respond back to the client with its public key. That's where we are. And we don't want this hacker to change this public key with this particular hacker's public key. And this was the private key. I erased it mistakenly, but yeah, coming back. So we don't want this hacker to change this particular public key of the server. So what server is going to do is that server is going to have a certificate pre-generated for itself. This certificate is going to be generated for this particular public key only, which means you can think that this particular certificate is generated only for this server and only for this particular public key that server was having. And this is what server is going to respond to the client. And this is what server is going to send to the client. Instead of just a public key, server is going to send a certificate that is generated for this particular server, also for this particular public key. Now, once that particular certificate and public key is sent, now this hacker cannot do anything at this point. It cannot change this public key with its public key. Why? Because this particular certificate is generated for the public key of our server here. It cannot work with this particular public key. And also this certificate which is generated for this server, this particular hacker cannot change that. Right? Now let's understand more about this particular thing. So let me remove and make some space, and I'll go over it again. So basically what happens is client needs to believe that the public key that it is getting is from a valid server, is from a server that it wants to establish the connection with, right? And for that, server is going to send a certificate. Now, server, before sending that certificate, server will have its own public key. So server is going to go to a certificate authority, and server is going to share its public key here. So this is the public key of the server, and certificate authority is going to create a certificate and sign, attach its signature. So here is the signature of the certificate authority. Let's say this certificate authority is A. So certificate authority A, which means this is signed by some certificate authority A. And this certificate authority A is going to send this particular certificate to the server. But who is going to trust this certificate authority A? For that, there is another intermediate certificate authority which will contain the public key of the certificate authority A. So this is public key of CAA. And this certificate is generated for certificate authority A. And let's say this intermediate certificate authority is called as certificate authority B, and hence certificate authority B is going to attach its signature certificate authority B like this. So who is going to trust certificate authority B? For that, we are going to have another intermediate certificate, and this certificate is going to contain the public key of certificate authority B, and this will be signed by some intermediate certificate authority C, and it goes on and on until there is a root certificate. So root certificate is a self-signed certificate, and there is no parent for this root certificate. So that's how this entire certificate chain is built. So this was signed by certificate authority A, this was signed by certificate authority B, this was signed by certificate authority C. This contained the public key of our server. This contained the public key of our certificate authority A. This contained the public key of certificate authority B, and so on and so forth until the root certificate was reached. And this entire chain is sent to the client. And client verifies the certificate chain, this trust chain, and client would then be confirmed that the public key that it is getting here, basically this particular public key, which is the server's public key, which when client receives here, client is going to be sure that it is coming from the right source, it is coming from the valid source. No one has replaced or no one has mutated that particular public key. It's pure, it's coming from the right source. Now that both client and server have this symmetric key, client has this symmetric key here and server has this symmetric key here, they both can transfer the payload by encrypting and decrypting the data, which means client can send the payload by encrypting using this symmetric key, and server can decrypt that data using the same symmetric key, and vice versa, which means server can send the payload to the client by encrypting using the symmetric key, and client can similarly decrypt it using the same symmetric key. And that's what we wanted to achieve. And this entire thing that we have learned right now is about the TLS handshake. If you remember earlier in this video, we saw that one major differentiator that is present in HTTPS is the TLS handshake. And this is what goes behind TLS handshake, in which the symmetric key is safely exchanged between client and server so that they both can have the same symmetric key. And after they have the symmetric key, the actual GET request is sent. So if you still have confusion, no worries. I'm going to quickly summarize it for you. So here is the client and here is the server. What we have understood is that in case of HTTPS, the first step is the TCP handshake. That's fine. In the second step, what we understood was that there is going to be a TLS handshake. In TLS handshake, client is going to send a message to the server saying that I want to connect with you and please accept my connection. And in that, client is also going to say these are the encryption and decryption algorithms that I support. And then finally, server is going to respond back to it with its public key. And that's what we have been seeing so far. Server is going to respond with the public key, like with all the certificates and all. And once client trusts that it is coming from the right server, client is going to encrypt the symmetric key with the server's public key and send it back to the server. And then finally, server is going to say that I have received and so on. And that's where the TLS handshake ends. And once the TLS handshake is done, client and server are going to have the symmetric key here. And the GET requests can be encrypted and decrypted using the symmetric key that was shared between client and server during the TLS handshake. One thing to note here is that this first message that client sends is also called as client hello. So you will see when you read about the TLS handshake more, you will see that the first message that comes from the client during TLS handshake is also called as client hello, and the response to the client hello is also called as server hello. And this entire second step is the TLS handshake. And from the third step that comes from here, the GET requests are sent. But GET requests will be encrypted using the symmetric key that was exchanged during the TLS handshake. So what we have learned till now was based on the TLS version 1.2. And I think the latest version that's going on is 1.3 that offers some more efficiency and improvement in the security over TLS version 1.2. I think one of the major performance improvement is done during the handshake with fewer messages exchanged. Here we see that there are up to 4 messages, like 1, 2, 3, and 4. 4 messages that are getting exchanged during the handshake, and I think that has been improved in the version 1.3. However, there is no disruptive change, so almost it is of course based on, it is an improvement over 1.2, so it is based on 1.2. So it's still good to know that there is a latest version of TLS 1.3 that's being used currently. And with that, I hope that you understood what is the difference between HTTP and HTTPS. And if you liked the video, please hit a like, share, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. And if you didn't like it, that's still okay. Please comment where did I fail to make you understand, and where was it difficult to understand. I'm definitely going to help you out, and I'm going to improve myself in the future videos. And with that, thank you, and I hope to see you in the next one.